Welcome to Pushback. I'm Aaron Maté. Joining me is Richard Sakwa. He is professor of Russian and European politics at the University of Kent. His books include Frontline Ukraine, Crisis in the Borderlands, and his latest, just out, Deception, Russiagate, and the New Cold War. Richard Sakwa, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
I want to start with Ukraine and Russia. As we are speaking, there have just been talks between Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. They ended pretty quickly. Now there is talk of a summit between Biden and Putin virtually. If you could set the conflict right now in Ukraine in context, how did we get to this current moment?
Yeah, this is the second time this year that we've seen a war threat emerging with Russian troop movements, Ukrainian troop movements, and so on. The immediate issue clearly is concern on both sides that there's going to be a forcible attempt to resolve the Donbass question, that is, the secessionist republics in that part of Ukraine. But the larger context is like a Russian doll, a Matryoshka doll, in which that conflict is nested in the larger one, which in the immediate context is the model of Ukrainian state building since 1991, where a certain Russophone population was objecting to a particular vision of Ukrainian statehood. A lot of authors who have pointed this out over the years, and it came to a crunch in 2014. And so then we had the counter movement, Crimea and Donbass. But even bigger than that is the failure since 1991 to establish what the Russians would certainly call an inclusive and equitable security order. And that, of course, is what was being discussed at the OSCE Security Conference just these last few days, where Blinken and Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, met.
So let me put you the conventional narrative that we get here in the U.S. I want to read you a couple of quotes. So one of them is from a new op-ed in the Washington Post from Michael McFaul, the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, and Alexei Honcharuk, a former Ukrainian prime minister under the current Ukrainian president, Zelensky. They write this: since 1939, the specter of an all-out conventional war in Europe between two major militaries has never been greater. Would you agree with that?
I would, even though I don't agree how they got to that point in the argument. The actual substance is that I actually do think that we are closer to war. Well, certainly I don't know about 1939, but since 1945, in terms of a Cold War. I argue that indeed we are in a second Cold War, accompanied by propaganda, disinformation, the demonization of the opponent. Plus, of course, the militarization of Europe. We have a new Iron Curtain now, no longer from Stettin in the north to Trieste in the south, but from all the way down to Mariupol in Ukraine. So yes, we are closer, and the language and the vitriol and the distrust, there's just no substantive basis for the powers, Russia, the United States, and its European allies to move beyond this impasse. And so, and of course, then we have a volatile situation, a front line in Ukraine, which could explode at any moment because, domestic politics, as always, even the first Cold War, often the tail wags the dog. Neither Russia nor the United States, of course, want conflict, but and of course, but these things happen. We saw the sleepwalking into 1914, and we have military exercises. We have U.S. planes. I mean, I think that this one study showed that nearly 2,000 near military misses have taken place since 2014. One day, planes will collide, ships will collide, something will happen, and we're off.
So you agree with the conclusion of Ambassador McFaul that we're closer to war than at any point since 1939. Let's talk about the differing perspectives, as you mentioned, on why that is. They say this, quote, Putin clearly does not want a stable and predictable relationship with Biden. He considers the U.S. to be Russia's greatest enemy. In his view, the Biden administration seeks to weaken Russia and overthrow his regime. With such a country as Putin sees it, there can never be stable, predictable cooperation, only perpetual conflict.
Yeah, I think it's quite the opposite. The idea that Putin, as an article in the New Statesman, this week's issue puts it, the agent of chaos and the fomenter of instability, is a complete mistake. It's in fact the opposite. Russia constantly wants stability. It wants a framework for order. And more than that, it is committed still to that international system and the international law established after 1945. That is the United Nations system and the system of international law, which has emerged on its basis. So, and it's in a sense, they would argue, certainly the Russians would argue, that it's the West that has become revisionist. It's the West that wants to destabilize the order by advancing a military alliance almost to Russia's borders. And also the idea that Putin needs some sort of external adventure in order to consolidate his position at home is also mistaken. I think that there's a whole stack of arguments involved here, including, of course, the view that what's going on in Ukraine is a Russian invasion or a Russian attack, when the refusal to accept there's the internal domestic, let's not perhaps call it a civil war, but civil contestation about the vision of Ukrainian statehood is homemade. And so what we see in this second Cold War is the constant projection of internal contradictions in Ukraine and indeed in the West, the Atlantic power system, onto Russia, which leads to a very mistaken view of the dynamics and motivations of the Russian leadership today, which leads, of course, to mistaken policies, which leads then to the intensification of the conflict and leads us to the danger of an inadvertent war. This is why the context is just so important. McFaul is, of course, one of the leading figures who insist that the domestic politics, the type of regime, affects and absolutely shapes foreign policy. I think that could be contested. Any basic realist views would suggest that Russia has national interest, it has concerns, and any power in Moscow would be concerned about a military alliance coming up to its borders. Even if NATO doesn't expand, as Putin has been saying over the last few months, Ukraine de facto is being armed with very offensive weapons, the Javelin and other things, which, of course, even Barack Obama refused to give because he warned that this would only intensify and exacerbate the conflict.
Right. And when Trump briefly paused those weapon sales, he was impeached, though the accompanying allegation was that he was doing so for political gain. But when Trump paused those weapons, this was seen as a mortal threat, not just to Ukraine, but to the United States. And actually, let me quote you someone who was a key figure in that. William Taylor was the former U.S. ambassador in Ukraine. And during the impeachment of Trump, he was presented in the U.S. as a big hero. And he was very outspoken in basically saying that any peace with Russia and Ukraine is essentially appeasement. And he recently in the Washington Post, I think, bragged about spoiling the prospects of peace in Ukraine. This is what he told the Washington Post. He said, Putin actually has a malign attitude towards the United States. He wants to stick it to America in whatever ways he can. And then the Post, this is David Ignatius of the Washington Post, goes on to write, Taylor recalls the warning he gave to President Zelensky after he became Ukraine's president in 2019 and was eager to negotiate a deal with Putin. And Taylor says this, quote, "Don't get sucked in." So it looks like Taylor here is telling Zelensky that to make a peace deal with Russia over Ukraine would be to get sucked in. And my question to you is, what is the U.S. goal here? Do they actually want to bring Ukraine into NATO?
Well, obviously, we know that since the Bucharest summit in April 2008, that has been promised, as well as to Georgia. So quite clearly, the US policy politicians do want this. We remember that, though, of course, was paused under Obama when NATO was taken off the table as an immediate agenda item. But of course, and it's obviously not on the table even now. But what we see is a sort of creeping NATOization of Ukraine with endless guarantees. As for the impeachment hearings, it wasn't just Taylor, it was Vindman, and almost all of them, if you read it, it's absolutely frightening with the idea, as I think Adam Schiff and others were arguing, that basically the front line, the defense of Washington, begins is on the Dnieper. It's absolutely extraordinary, extravagant language, irresponsible language, and of course meaningless, because it's ultimately, if push came to shove, then quite clearly, as Obama kept saying, Russia has escalation dominance. If it came to a military conflict, Russia can mobilize far more forces in that locality than the United States, several thousand kilometers away. It'd be disastrous, of course, for all concerned. So that language and the atmosphere, the hothouse atmosphere in Washington and in those impeachment hearings in particular, is quite extraordinary, because ultimately the question is, what is the US strategic goal? It should be peace. It should be some sort of framework in which Russia is part of the solution, instead of which being constantly externalized as an enemy. So this is absolutely dangerous talk. I mean, there's a marvelous book, which I'm sure you know, William Hill, called No Place for Russia, which describes how, since 1991, desperate attempts by Yeltsin and then Putin to establish an inclusive security order, and indeed Medvedev with his ideas in 2008. So the idea is that you can't negotiate with Moscow because it doesn't want to deal, or that any negotiation effectively is appeasement, is sort of crazy talk. That means there can be no diplomacy, there can be no engagement, no dialogue, no working on common issues. Though Biden, of course, after the Geneva summit, has established a working party on cyber issues and on strategic security, which is very welcome. And so there is talk going on, but in an atmosphere of fundamental distrust.
A lot of people in the US on the liberal progressive side were so excited that Trump was getting impeached that they didn't pay attention, or they looked away from what was actually being said during his impeachment hearings. And the quote you mentioned by Schiff:
"The United States aids Ukraine and her people so that we can fight Russia over there and we don't have to fight Russia here."
The United States aids Ukraine and her people so that they can fight Russia over there and we don't have to fight Russia here.
Yeah, that is an extraordinary statement. Schiff, of course, has a track record of obviously wild talk. I'm not quite sure where he's coming from, and both on this, and of course he was one of the major peddlers of the Russiagate issue, and of course the two are connected. And it's a vision of the world which is dark, which is ultimately completely disconnected from reality, from the genuine concerns of Moscow, as if they just simply don't exist, that Russia's out there to destroy and to subvert and to undermine Western democracy and achieve, indeed, instability. There's absolutely no evidence for that being a fundamental policy. Obviously, all security services do a lot of things in the dark, but as a state national strategy, that's not where Moscow is at. And therefore, I think that, as you say, that's one reason why there were some people sympathetic to Trump in Moscow. Not everyone, so that's been exaggerated, when Trump said the right thing from this perspective, that it makes sense to get on with Russia. And of course, he was demonized for that statement. He was then blocked in achieving that. And we are where we are today. As McFarlane, I think anybody who is sensibly looking at the situation today in a more parlous position than any since 1945. In a sense, we're talking about a slow-burning Cuban Missile Crisis.
So let me just ask you to talk more about this crisis in particular and how we got here. For people who are not familiar with the circumstances around the Maidan coup in 2014 in Ukraine, the way it's portrayed in the US is that there was a democratic revolution that ousted a pro-Russian president, Yanukovych. Russia reacted with aggression by seizing Crimea and essentially helping spark a proxy war in the Donbass in the east of Ukraine. Can you respond to that narrative and just explain for people who are not familiar with how this conflict started back in 2014, what really happened?
Well, the fuse, if you like, was lit by the plan to sign an association agreement with the European Union, which, of course, was also expanding. This association agreement was due to be signed in November 2013. And while, of course, in my view, it's very sensible for Ukraine to have close relations with the EU, why not, you may say? But there were also security issues involved there. When Yanukovych saw this in November, he decided to put the signing on pause. And then we had the Maidan occupation, which lasted from November all the way through to February.
These are the protests in Maidan Square.
The Maidan, the protest initially against the postponement of the signing of the EU, the European Union Association Agreement, and then it became a popular revolution supported and endorsed by Victoria Nuland and many other Western leaders, which in the end turned out to be a violent confrontation on the Maidan, the central Independence Square in the center of Kiev. The thing about the Maidan events, you mentioned the word coup. It was a coup, but it was other things as well. There were genuine attempts to achieve some sort of democratic breakthrough. So there were elements of this revolution of dignity, but in the end, the civic side of it was overtaken, in fact, defeated on the Maidan. So there were two conflicts. There was a conflict within the insurgency, and there was one, of course, against the government of Yanukovych. And of course, we actually had a deal with the European Union, the European collection of foreign ministers, on the 21st of February 2014, had a deal. And then there was the shooting in the square that day, which much of it came from the insurgency itself.
But it was blamed on Yanukovych.
It was not by Yanukovych and not his forces, the Berkut. It was from the militants on the Maidan who shot demonstrators in the back. And we have a lot of evidence of this. And so this is why we can talk, and it's legitimate to talk of a coup. A deal was signed and agreed, but then the Maidan rejected it. But by then, Yanukovych had stood down his forces. He found himself defenseless. Hence, the next day, he went to Kharkov and finally fled the country. And we had a very powerful neo-nationalist government come to power illegally in all sorts of ways. But in the circumstances, you may say, okay, they had no choice. And this neo-nationalist government was quite clearly intent on revising the agreement, above all, with a Sevastopol naval base in the Crimea, which is the home of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Now, people tell me that they'd never seen Putin more angry after these events when Yanukovych. When you say pro-Russian, by the way, this term, pro-Russian, is almost meaningless. It's trotted out as if this delegitimizes him. He was the legally elected leader of Ukraine, and he had about a year left on his term. Elections were due to come up. They agreed to preterm or earlier elections. There was a legal way out, instead of which we had this effective forced change of power, which would also not just perhaps, was not particularly democratic. It also would have changed the geopolitical balance in the region. And the idea that US forces would take over this Sevastopol naval base is what it was all about. Initially, when it came to Crimea, it wasn't about anything else other than, absolutely clear and present danger that Sevastopol that the Russian forces would be expelled from that, and that US forces, not NATO, but US forces would take it over. And that would have represented the biggest defeat, military, geopolitical defeat of Russia in the last 1,000 years. It's so big, that issue, and the West simply does not recognize that Moscow has been fighting, it doesn't have two major oceans to defend itself. It has no mountains to defend itself, no major rivers. It's set on a vast North Eurasian plain with no defensible borders, and a constant sense of threat from the West, from NATO, considers itself so benign, so good, so democratic, and yet it simply cannot even exercise its democratic rights, but it's bound up with its geopolitical jostling for advantage all the time since 1991. And of course, today, Russia has had enough. It had enough in 2014. And that's why Putin talks about red lines. This doesn't mean endorsing the Russian or the Moscow position. It simply means taking a sober, balanced view of where we are today, in which we can understand that we're in a security dilemma of the most intense form, and therefore it behooves us all to try to find a way out.
What do you think happened to President Zelensky of Ukraine? If I recall his campaign correctly, he campaigned on a platform of making peace with Russia. As I quoted Bill Taylor earlier, warning Zelensky against that. Do you think Zelensky caved to pressure from the U.S., or was he ever sincere about following through on his campaign platform of peace? What happened with him?
I think he was sincere. If you remember, there was a meeting of the in the Normandy format. Those are the endorsers of the Minsk protocols for peace. This was in December 2019 in France, where Putin attended, Zelensky attended, together with President Macron and with Angela Merkel from Germany. And it was quite clear that he was intent on achieving something. There was a talk at that stage of a Steinmeier formula, which was a way of implementing a peace deal. But he went home after this meeting, and of course, already the Maidan was once again being blockaded by the militants, and his government became hostage to the militants. And then since then, of course, his position has much weakened, and he's playing, as so many Ukrainian leaders do, the hyper-nationalist card. And so, yes, he was sincere, but you could argue that ultimately he turned out to be a weak leader, an ineffective leader, and one who cannot make the political weather, and became hostage to extremist forces. So then, he's now calling, and he has been for the last few months, for another meeting in the Normandy format with Putin. But the Russians are saying, look, you need to have something substantive to talk about. It's no good talking and trying to find a pathway to peace, only to find it being blocked by the militants in Ukraine. So the impasse is complete. And of course, since then, he has been the most violent in calling for the militarization of the conflict, more and more weapons to be piled in, and which is also, like throwing more and more tinder onto a burning bonfire. And the West, of course, is piling in more and more offensive arms. The British, of course, signed a naval deal, training. It cannot be considered more dangerous. While Russia did go to that meeting in Normandy format, looking for a solution, clearly Russia cannot simply allow the transfer of 2.5 million people in the Donbass back to Ukraine without certain guarantees. Meanwhile, in Ukraine, they cannot accept autonomy for the Donbass as promised in the Minsk a deal. So, the question then is, where do we go from here? And the solution to Ukraine ultimately has to be in some sort of discussion, not even with European leaders anymore. And that's why Putin has called, or is arguing for, the need for a high-level summit with Biden to de-escalate in the first instance, and then perhaps find a pathway to some sort of peace, which includes, there's only one way that can be done, and that is to take NATO enlargement off the board and the demilitarization, it doesn't mean to say disarmament, but demilitarization of this conflict in Ukraine. And a lot of people would argue some sort of neutralization. Of course, that's highly controversial, but ultimately better to have something controversial and sensible than something sliding into war.
And taking NATO enlargement off the table, by the way, is not exactly a novel, controversial idea. It was, of course, the pledge that the U.S. made to end the Cold War to the Soviet Union, a pledge that they, of course, have continuously violated in the decades since then. Zelensky, I should have mentioned, recently accused Russia of attempting to launch a coup against him. I'm wondering what you thought about that. And I also wanted to ask you to talk more about Minsk too, because that's supposedly the framework for peace that is supposed to end this thing, but it just hasn't been implemented. And I'm curious why it hasn't been successful.
As for the coup, It's not the first time that Zelensky has talked about this. And so in the febrile atmosphere in Kiev, there's these sort of ideas pop up from time to time. As for Minsk II, there's the fundamental thing one has to understand about it, is that it was, right from the start, a formula for the Donbass to return to Ukrainian sovereignty. Public opinion polls at the time, I'm talking about 2014 and into 2015, quite clearly showed that the majority wanted to remain within the Ukrainian state, but with a degree of devolved, a degree of autonomy. And that is still the agenda for Minsk II. And the issue is that the militants, certainly within Ukraine, and indeed large swathes of the Western Ukrainian population, refused to grant autonomy to the Donbass. They would argue that this would allow Russia a permanent foothold in Ukraine. It would be acting as a permanent threat to block NATO enlargement. Of course, as you say, it all comes back to NATO enlargement, which, in substance, the actual fact of enlargement itself is not so much the issue. It's the way it was done without genuine, inclusive security framework within which Russia could feel secure. So in other words, NATO could enlarge if we had, for example, as I've been calling for, is some sort of pan-European security treaty, including a Security Council in which Russia is not just a participant and to be informed of decisions taken elsewhere, but an actual shaper of security. And that's never happened since 1991. And of course, it simply cannot be, because even when, as you say, it wasn't just James Baker in February 1990 who pledged no NATO enlargement. A dozen Western leaders did so. We have it chapter and verse. And the worst thing is today is that a lot of these same leaders and Western commentators not only deny that such a pledge was given, they deny even that there was even discussion of the issue. So it's absolutely a travesty of what was going on earlier. And of course, this has been, I argue that between 1991 and 2014, we had a cold peace in which none of the fundamental questions of European security were resolved. And since 2014, we've then slid into a Cold War II. And of course, today, this Cold War II may well end up as a World War III. I don't think we are that close to it. It's a dangerous moment, definitely. Hence, McFaul and colleagues are correct. But it's more dangerous, as I say, than anything we've seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And the worst thing is that we don't have leaders of the stature of a John F. Kennedy, or even, dare I say it, a Nikita Khrushchev.
You don't think Putin is hoping to dial this down? Do you think he wants a war with Ukraine?
Absolutely not. It's there's on any level, there is no sense to the war, because what would Russia achieve? It would be catastrophic. Absolutely not. The whole point of the military forces are preemptive, to stop the Ukrainians being adventuristic. And of course, as we've touched on, Zelensky seems to be becoming more and more erratic over the last few months, if not a couple of years. So the idea was to preempt it. This is why there was the mobilization in the springtime, in particular because Ukraine is being armed, and not just Western arms, but also Turkey has provided the Bayraktar TB2 drones, which were so effective in the Azerbaijani-Armenian war in the autumn of 2020, when Armenia lost the territories, or Azerbaijan regained its lost territories from the first Nagorno-Karabakh war in the early 1990s. And these drones have now been used in the Donbass, and they are, I'm sure people are saying in Kiev, a game changer. So it may lead them on to some sort of adventurism, which would lead to conflict. No, so the move is defensive, and just to stop, as it were. And in a sense, we should welcome the Russian mobilization, because it dampens down perhaps the hotheads in Kiev who may wish to make a quick dash to do what the Azerbaijanis did in 2020, and indeed the Croats way back over Slavonia back in the early 1990s in the former Yugoslavia.
How big is the neo-Nazi fascist component of the Ukrainian armed forces?
Well, Dmitry Yarosh, the leader of right sector, has now become an advisor to the military. And so it's worse than that, is that we see let's not perhaps use the word fascist or Nazi. There's certainly plenty of those. When I was there in the Maidan just after the overthrow of Yanukovych, a huge portrait of Bandera, Stepan Bandera, the leader of the nationalist or extreme neo-fascist forces in Ukraine during the Second World War. So that is there. But that, in a sense, isn't the key point. What we do have, though, is a very powerful movement which I call a neo-nationalist. It's neo-nationalist because that model of Ukrainian state building is exclusive. It's neo, and why I add the neo to this nationalist is because it has a high degree of civic inclusivity to it. That it's not fascist. It's something perhaps it's more insidious, and in this context, perhaps even more dangerous because it's a very narrow vision of what a modern Ukrainian state should look like, and that vision excludes the Russophone population as Russophones. Of course, they're included if they have to give up an element of their language and so on, as we've seen since the Maidan coup, let's call it that, 2014. The Russian language, film, the education, everything has been pushed back. My view is that the 1996 Ukrainian constitution, which made the Ukrainian language the only state language, was a fundamental mistake. Many people who argue, well, you can understand that they haven't had statehood, that this is they're bending the stick too far the other way. I don't accept those arguments. I can understand them, but it was a type of statehood which we've seen in Estonia, which we've seen in Latvia, which excludes a part of its population. I'm not saying that this part of the population is deprived of their human rights. They're not. But they're deprived of an element, well, mostly not, but they're deprived of an element of their civic identity. That therefore federalization and some sort of consociationalism, there's a whole stack of methods in which a modern state can be built. Yet these three states have built their states on exclusivity, on a distorted vision of history, which they then deploy against Russia today, which ultimately makes a peace deal or peace and security and dialogue and the free friendship of peoples almost impossible. It fosters hatred. And this is one of the things which I find particularly upsetting about Western leaders and, in fact, European Union leaders, is just how weak, almost non-existent, their condemnation of what is flouting of fundamental principles of the European peace order as it developed after 1945.
So let's talk about your new book, Deception, Russiagate, and the New Cold War. There is an endless stack of books about Russiagate that have promoted the underlying narrative of a sweeping Russian interference campaign and Trump campaign collusion with it. You're in a very small stack of books, probably less than a dozen, that has taken a critical look at Russiagate, and I hope personally to join you in that stack of books one day. What was it like for you as a scholar of Russia, observing just how consumed U.S. politics got with this frenzied fear-mongering picture of Russia for more than 4 years, this idea that Russia was manipulating U.S. democracy through its email hackers and social media bots, and just how insane it got with presidents, with allegations that the president was an asset of the Russian government?
Yes, it was ultimately so bizarre. And this is what led me to decide to do this book. This was, I watched it throughout 2016 and then into 2017, the way that the whole allegations stymied attempts, because if you recall that 2 times in the first half of 2017, once Trump was in the White House, Russia sent messages to the White House saying, let's talk, let's establish a peace deal of the sort we were talking about a few minutes ago, which may well have avoided this conflict or found a way out of the conflict in Ukraine. And of course, the State Department and these were brusquely rejected in that frenzy of allegations that somehow or other Trump was a Siberian or Manchurian candidate working on behalf of Moscow. And there's 2 things. There's the domestic US angle to it, which shows the signs, which has only got worse since then, of such intense polarization, of such intense distrust, and in which almost all sides were willing to trample on facts, on the evidence, and make assertions which were in a sort of a permanent echo chamber where the secret services, the intelligence services, put something into the media, to the Washington Post or some other newspaper, New York Times, which have been in the vanguard of the Russiagate allegations, which then becomes amplified by a think tanker, which then goes back to the security services. Look, there's we have to establish a counterintelligence investigation. So look, the state, the patrie is en danger, is in danger, and so that's the domestic side, and it shows a degradation of the public sphere, above all, of classic principles of journalism where you need at least 2 pieces of evidence before you publish, etc. All of that went out of the window. And of course, the second thing, and they fed on each other, was this dynamic towards international conflict, this new Cold War. And so it wasn't an accident that the main perpetrator was allegedly Russia, because that had now become almost a standard enemy, the demon who was trying to subvert US democracy. So these 2 elements, that is the geopolitical situation on the one side, and inside the United States, the degradation of democracy and the distortion of the public sphere, which then fed on each other. And of course, they're still feeding on each other. We're not, so Russiagate is still a legacy. People talk about the endless, Russian subversion and intervention, when, clearly we are locked in a Cold War. There is disinformation going on. There is misinformation. There's mutual propaganda going on. But it all, in the sense that we're in a bundle now in which my hope was with this book that let's get the facts right. And I must say in all of this, that in amidst all of this frenzy, as you say, this insanity, there have been sane voices in all of this. Your work has been outstanding. Matt Taibbi, Ray McGovern, Jack Matlock, the penultimate US ambassador to Russia, and a few others have been, as it were, beacons to show. And I also say this, that the United States is such a complex ecosystem that there are people out there still fighting for balance, for genuine evidence-based journalism, and so that gives a little scope for optimism.
What I find amazing, among many things, is that even if everything that Russia was accused of were true, which I don't personally think they are based on the evidence. I don't think Russia launched this sweeping interference campaign, and I don't think Russia stole the emails, but I can't prove that for sure. We still have to see more evidence. But regardless, even if all of it were true, everything Russia was accused of true, the way it was described as if it was this foreign intervention akin to Pearl Harbor and 9/11. I mean, literally, people like Hillary Clinton and top intelligence officials were equating this to 9/11 or Pearl Harbor. That's the part that I found very dangerous about all this, because as you say, and this continued into, the sequel to Russiagate, the impeachment over Ukraine-Gate, the way Russia was described is that it was this, irrational, domineering enemy that sought to destroy American democracy. I mean, that was the rhetoric we heard constantly.
Vladimir Putin could care less about delivering health care for the people of Russia, for building infrastructure in Russia. Vladimir Putin, as many people in this chamber know well, because I've worked with some of you on this, wakes up every morning and goes to bed every night trying to figure out how to destroy American democracy. And he has organized the infrastructure of his government around that effort.
And it was legitimized not from, right wingers, the traditional domain of, Cold War chauvinism, but across the liberal spectrum too, in ways that certainly I don't think liberals had said before, at least in my lifetime.
Absolutely. This was one of the most disturbing things that the Democratic Party, and we mentioned Adam Schiff earlier, was in a vanguard of all of this, and one could say make it worse, that it appears, and the John Durham investigations seem to confirm this, and it's in my book, the chapter and verse, that in a sense, the whole Russiagate thing was inspired by the Clinton camp, the Clinton campaign, quite explicitly, in conjunction with the security services. I won't name names, but CIA and others were involved right from the start in a campaign which was deliberately designed to implicate Russia in what would, if it was true, would genuinely have been a frightening intrusion into the domestic affairs, because no country likes its internal affairs to be the subject of external manipulation. But as you say, the fact, the worst thing in all of this is that at every level, at every stage in this chain, all the way back to the alleged hacking of the Democratic National Committee emails, then the way they got to WikiLeaks, and then the way that they were mobilized by the Clinton camp. And of course, behind it all, we have people working. This is Fusion GPS and the Steele dossier, which was dripping information into the public sphere of a monumental intervention, which was then exacerbated by the Clinton campaign. But she, of course, again, the two things come together because she had form, and in her books before the election, she showed a visceral detestation of Putin, which was very strange. It was a classic demonization. And I just give one example of her memoirs as her time as Secretary of State. She says in this book that Putin hates women. Now, again, it's one of those statements which, a liberal in New York may endorse and say, oh, he's a bit macho. Yes, he is. And you won't find Vladimir Putin doing the washing up. He's an traditional, old-fashioned Soviet-style Russian male. But in terms of hating women, nonsense. The governor of the Central Bank of Russia today is Elvira Nabiullina. There's Golikova as a minister of social welfare. There's a whole stack of ministers in the Russian government and in high positions, I won't go through the whole list, in which Putin treats with deepest respect. And in fact, he has extended Nabiullina's term at the CBR, the Bank of Russia, for a second term, and has always worked well with her. So, this idea is just so bizarre. But this is, again, if you like, the cultural framework for the two things we're talking about. The Russiagate within the United States and then its external geopolitical context is the third one, which is a cultural one, and this growing cultural gulf in the type of liberal progressivism as it has taken shape in the United States. Much of it we can endorse. Much of it is actually very positive and we can endorse. But the shape and the frame in which it is then couched becomes then part of an aggressive culture war, which is fought, as we know, bitterly within the United States. And this is now being projected externally. And of course, Russia, as always, seems to fall into the trap. And it itself, of course, is enacting rather backward-looking legislation, which only makes things worse. And so we're into this spiral of distrust. But the cultural element is quite important, I think, in all of this.
Let me ask you finally, and this is a bit of speculation because it's hard to know exactly what people's motives were, but in terms of the driving factors behind Russiagate. So for the Clinton campaign, it's pretty easy. They were facing this scandal over Hillary Clinton's email server. They needed something to distract from that. Hillary Clinton, as you said, already had this visceral dislike for Russia and Putin. So coming up with this conspiracy theory that Trump was a Russian asset, from their point of view, was a good strategy. Uh, but from the point of view of the national security state, and connecting this back to how we began this discussion about places like Ukraine. So Trump on the campaign trail was talking about not spending all this money on NATO, and he was criticizing NATO, and he was criticizing U.S. interventionism in Libya and Syria. And so I'm just wondering, from your reading of this, whether you think that the prospect of Trump reversing policies, or at least rhetorically criticizing policies when it comes to the deep U.S. involvement in Ukraine, launching the coup there, the deep U.S. involvement in the dirty war in Syria, the catastrophic foreign intervention, a U.S.-led intervention in Libya, to what extent that motivated national security state actors in the U.S. who didn't like what Trump was saying? And that's separated from what Trump was actually willing to do, because I personally don't think he was ever going to seriously change U.S. policy. But certainly rhetorically, he was saying things that no presidential candidate of that stature had been saying before.
Yeah, just one thing in terms of the motivation of Hillary Clinton, what the DNC emails, however they got into the public domain, what they showed was the manipulation within the DNC of the campaign of one of the Democratic contenders, Bernie Sanders, who astonishingly won 23 primaries in 2016. And of course, the country was ripe for change. It wanted change. And Sanders offered change. Trump offered change. And of course, Clinton as a campaigner was a disaster, because she was the representation precisely of all that was at fault, which is, I don't want to use the term the deep state, but I will say that, and in the book I argue, and I use this model of Glennon talks about this double state. You have on the one side the Madisonian state, and that is the the courts, the political elections and parties and so on. On the other side, you have the Trumanite state. You have this security state which developed in the first Cold War, and it was never dismantled at the end of the Cold War in 1991. And though it tried to, in its NATO form, it went out of region, it went to all sorts of places to be active. But you do have this huge, you remember that communist Eisenhower in his farewell address talked about a military-industrial complex. Yes, and now we're talking about military-industrial media intelligence complex. And of course, fed and part by the British intelligence services, which are very deeply implicated in all of Russiagate. So when Trump emerges as a threat to all of this, and of course to the traditional alliance system, as you say, I agree with you. I don't think there was much prospect of him actually doing all that much positive in that framework. But the thing about Trump is that he asked the right questions. Even earlier, he said, what are we doing in Afghanistan? What is our end game? How are we going to get there? And all the other questions. What is NATO for? Because you don't have to be a Trumpist to argue that NATO is unique in world history as a major military alliance which continues 30 years after the reason for its foundation has gone, that is, to fight the Cold War with the Soviet Union, which no longer existed. So what we actually have is the institutions and the ideology of Cold War I maintained entirely. And of course, without the restraint of the Soviet Union, they went, you could argue, berserk. I don't think they went quite so berserk, but they certainly were unlimited in their ambition. Liberal internationalism, which was very fine and positive, if you like, until 91, became liberal hegemony. And that's a very different beast entirely, because it has no room for anyone else. It doesn't have any room for Russia. It doesn't have any room for China. It's an ideology of dominance, of permanent dominance, permanent, effectively, militarization. People, don't forget also that Obama also was talking about, and that's why he got the Peace Prize, to try to ramp this down. Of course, again, he failed. So it wasn't just Trump not delivering on his promises. Obama signally failed. And of course, he wanted Peace Prize because of his talk about nuclear issues. And of course, he launched a modernization of US nuclear forces, which is going to cost at least $1 trillion, if not more.
Yeah.
So it's a very dangerous situation.
One of my favorite quotes about NATO comes from you, Richard Sakwa, and then we'll end. You wrote, "There's a fateful geographical paradox. NATO exists to manage the risks created by its existence."
Absolutely. I stick to that. In other words, NATO and the whole Atlantic alliance system, because it's exclusive. It's, I don't use the word, it's a sort of hermetic, it's closed. And therefore, you can only join it if you accept the terms and you become a subordinate. Now, Moscow would never become a subordinate. Beijing will never become a subordinate. Japan, of course, was defeated in a war. So yes, we're now seeing a system, a Cold War II feeds on itself. And therefore, it's so hard to understand the logic of this conflict. And I'm afraid, most sadly, because it's so amorphous, it's very hard to think of a way out of this conflict.
Since you mentioned Beijing, let me just ask you, because I forgot, I think it's important. It seems now as if Russia and China are growing increasingly close. There's talk of an alliance. Is there going to be a formal Russia-China alliance that of the kind that has not happened in ever?
No, if you'd asked me this even a couple of weeks ago, I would have said no. I've always used the word an alignment. But in recent times, there's now, even some senior Chinese commentators have floated the idea of some sort of a military pact. Both Russia and China eschew the language of bloc politics, of alliances. That's for the West. But they would work together. However, they both feel themselves under threat. And of course, two powers under threat will work closer together. The idea of Biden that he could, as it were, stabilize relations with Russia, which was sensible, but in order to focus on China and perhaps drive a wedge between Moscow and Beijing, that is not going to work. So the Russian-Chinese alignment is for the long term.
All right. Richard Sakwa, professor of Russian and European politics at the University of Kent. His books include Frontline Ukraine, Crisis in the Borderlands, and his latest, Deception, Russiagate and the New Cold War. Richard Sakwa, thank you very much.
Thank you.